Today I'm going to show you how I designed and built this pedestal-style dining table that utilizes traditional joinery to support its weight without the help of a center support piece. I'm calling this piece the Black Widow table because of the hourglass-shaped base and black walnut it has been built from. Before we get started, let's go over the design of this table-based construction because it's not as complicated as it looks. The base is comprised of just three distinct shapes and comes together using cross-slap and angled bridle joints. We have this trapezoidal-shaped cross brace with tenons on each end and a cross-slap joint on the top face. This additional cross brace that is exactly the same except for the cross-slap is on the bottom face. And finally, this parallelogram-shaped leg component that has the mortise for our bridle joint on one end. The cross-slap joint comes together like so, and the leg component completes our angled bridle joint like this. Add the additional three leg components and we have half of the base complete. Double the entire setup and flip it upside down, and that's the full shape. Now, I wasn't sure if these miter joints would be strong enough to keep the base from collapsing with glue alone, so I'm going to go ahead and add some splines to strengthen the joint and complement the angled bridle joints. Off camera, I milled the boards to final thickness and width, but I left them a little bit long to give myself some wiggle room to dial in the joinery. I'm going to swap out my normal table saw blade for a dado stack in order to cut out the cross-slap and angled bridle joints. A dado stack is a set of blades and chippers that allows you to cut a wider kerf than a normal blade can, which will allow the joinery to be cut much quicker and more efficiently. I decided to cut the cross-slap joints first, so I don't have to worry about getting it perfectly centered along the length of the piece. Once the cross-slap joints have been cut, I check the fit to make sure it's snug, as this joint will help give rigidity to the table base and resist racking forces. All of the joinery on this table base is cut to 45 degrees, so I'm going to set my table saw blade to 45 degrees and cut all of the ends of the leg components before cutting in the angled bridle joints. After cutting out the 45-degree bevels on the cross brace pieces, I work on batching out the parallelogram-shaped leg components using a stop block to ensure that they have consistent lengths. All of the table components are 3 inches in width, so the mortise and tenon of each bridle joint needs to be 1 inch in width. I use a tenoning jig on the table saw to cut the mortise of each of the 8 leg components. And I use a miter gauge set to 45 degrees to cut the tenon portion of the joint. I should mention that the entire design for this table base was really born around wanting to try the angled bridle joint. I had never done this before, and after working around with it in SketchUp and 3D modeling it, that's sort of where the base design was born out of. Off camera, I glued up these miter joints, and although initial testing on a 1/3 scale model I built months prior showed that they were likely strong enough to hold up, I still felt that it was best to go ahead and add the splines for additional strength to the joint to make sure nothing happens. Before gluing up the base, I use my drill press to cut some recessed holes in the top cross brace sections so that I can mount the top to the base using bolts later. I prefer to do a lot of sanding before I glue up the base, just because it can be difficult to get into tight spaces once everything is together. So what you see me doing here is drawing pencil line on all of the pieces I plan to pre-sand. This is a pretty common trick among fine woodworkers to help you gauge when you're done sanding with a specific grit and help you avoid over sanding. The process is simple enough. You simply sand until you see the pencil marks erased, and once you see that they have disappeared, you know that you're done with that specific grit and are ready to move on to a higher grit. I prefer to do my glue ups in stages, so I begin assembling the base by gluing the angled bridle joints individually rather than all at once in order to ensure everything comes together cleanly. After ensuring I have sufficient glue coverage, I squeeze the joint with a clamp and check to make sure the leg is angled at a perfect 45 degrees. After the four angled bridle joints are cured, I glue the first cross lap together for the bottom cross brace. Next, I glue the remaining angled bridle and cross lap joints on the top half to complete the base assembly. Here you can see the recessed holes I drilled earlier on the top cross brace, which are slightly oversized to allow the mounting bolts to wiggle in order to account for seasonal wood movement that the tabletop will experience with changes in humidity. Next, I begin working on the tabletop by breaking down the rough lumber to more manageable sizes to be milled square and flat. Rough lumber can have unreleased tension, so making a series of shallow cuts at the miter saw helps prevent kickback. My jointer can only mill boards up to 6 inches in width, so I rip these wider boards at the bandsaw first, as it is unlikely to cause kickback, which almost certainly would happen if I tried this on the table saw. Now I can run one face of each board through the jointer, taking several shallow passes until the board is nice and flat. I can then run the boards through my thickness planer to get the opposite board face flat and parallel to the other side. Back at the jointer, I get one edge flat and perpendicular to the two faces, again taking shallow passes until any crook in the edge is eliminated. With my boards milled on two faces and one edge, I can now safely rip them to final width at the table saw, using my jointed edge against the fence to ensure the opposite edge comes out square and parallel. Before gluing up my tabletop, I use the in-out method to get perfect glue seams. At every glue seam, I mark an I for in and an O for out and run each of those edges through the jointer one last time, with the I side against the fence and the O side away from it. This ensures that the seams come together tight even if my jointer fence is not at a perfect 90 degrees. Again, glue ups can be very stressful, so I tackle this 9-board tabletop in stages, where I only glue 3 boards at a time so that I only have to worry about 2 glue seams at a time. Some woodworkers like myself prefer to wipe away glue squeeze out before everything dries using a damp rag, and others like to leave it and scrape away the dried squeeze out after it has cured. There are those who argue that wiping away the squeeze out can water down and weaken the joint or cause issues with adding finish. However, I have not found that to be the case in my work, so I'm sticking with team wipe away. Let me know down in the comments which method you prefer. I suppose technically I subscribe to both methods. After my full panel is glued together, I use a router mounted to a circle cutting jig and take shallow passes until I cut away all the excess and am left with a perfectly circular tabletop. Another first for me. Now on to everyone's least favorite task. Although sanding tends to get extremely boring and tedious, I do always enjoy revealing the beautiful grain pattern as it starts to feel like the light at the end of the tunnel. Before applying finish, I add a slight round over to the edges of the tabletop. I didn't want to go too crazy with the edge profile on this table, as the grain pattern of the top and geometry of the base are supposed to be the stars of the show. In another first for me, I am using Rubio Monocoat for my finish. I have always been a polyurethane guy, but that tends to leave the wood with a plasticky feeling, and this hard wax oil finish will not only bring out the natural beauty of the wood, but give it a more natural feel. Most people advise using a white Scotch-Brite pad to work the finish into the wood, but the guys at the hardwood dealer I bought my materials from said to simply work the finish with your hands while wearing rubber gloves, so I went with that method. After letting the finish cure for a few minutes, I wiped away the excess using an old white t-shirt. It's bad form to leave one side of your tabletop unfinished for a very long time, as the imbalance can lead to the top warping and ruining your project. So I immediately flip the top over and repeat the process on the unfinished side. I let the tabletop cure while I went on vacation, and the temperature has dropped dramatically in my shop. Luckily, I'm almost at the end as I add Rubio Monocoat to the table base. Despite the name monocoat, applying a second coat to walnut will improve the look of the wood. I used a maroon 3M pad to lightly scuff up the surface of the tabletop in preparation for the second coat, which I believe improved the color, contrast, and sheen. While I work on applying this final coat, I want to thank Rockler Woodworking, as well as Sean Boyd and Chris Salamone for sponsoring the Rockler Try That Challenge, of which this is my official submission. Chris and Sean have been great inspirations to me in both furniture design and woodworking techniques, and I will link to their channels below because if you enjoyed this video, you most certainly will enjoy their content. Thanks, guys. Finally, I drilled some shallow holes in the underside of the tabletop to accept these threaded inserts my mounting bolts will thread into. And with that, this build is complete. The purpose of the Rockler Try That Challenge was to push yourself to try new things in your woodworking journey and to get out of your comfort zone to progress as a maker, and I believe that this build certainly accomplished that. First time cutting angled bridle joints, first time making a round tabletop, first time using a new finish, and the first time making a build video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.